There's something about relationships that's rarely spoken aloud but is always present, like an invisible force guiding our emotional choices. When someone deeply attracts us, when we feel that intense and almost inexplicable connection, the tendency is to believe we're facing a magical encounter, something that came from outside ourselves. But according to Jung, what draws us to others doesn't come from them. It comes from within us. Jung argued that the human psyche is made up of multiple layers. There's what you show to the world, what you've learned to accept as part of who you are. But there's also what has been repressed, forgotten, or excluded. Everything deemed unacceptable, inappropriate, dangerous, or fragile gets pushed into the unconscious. And that forgotten part doesn't vanish. It turns into shadow. For Jung, the shadow isn't just what's negative or dark. It also holds talents, impulses, traits, and desires you don't recognize because, at some point in your life, it wasn't safe to express them. Everything that was denied piled up there, in the hidden side of your psyche. Over time, it starts seeking ways to surface. And one of the most powerful ways the shadow emerges is through relationships. When you feel a deep attraction to someone, it might not just be about who they are. It might be about what they awaken in you, what they represent in your inner world. Jung called this projection an unconscious mechanism where you see in others what's hidden within yourself. That's why you're often drawn to people who carry exactly what you lost at some point in life. You might be someone who learned to be rational, restrained, strong all the time. Then you find yourself deeply attracted to someone sensitive, emotional, instinctive, not because that person is better, but because they represent a part of you that was left behind. You're not just longing for them. You're longing to rediscover something repressed within yourself. That's why the attraction is so powerful. At its core, it's your unconscious trying to remind you of who you truly are, whole. What you see in the other is a clue, a sign, a reflection. When you feel that person has something you lack, it's not that you need them to complete you, it's that they show you what you need to integrate. This completely shifts how we view relationships. Love stops being about compatibility or chance and becomes a tool for revelation. And that revelation isn't always comfortable. On the contrary, sometimes what attracts you most also terrifies you, because you sense there's something there that could transform you. And like all transformation, it involves risk. It means stepping out of the familiar. It means touching parts of yourself that have been dormant for a long time. The intensity of a passion isn't always tied to love. Often, it's tied to how much unconscious content you've projected onto that bond. You're not just looking at the other, you're looking at yourself through them. And the more unconscious that projection is, the blinder you'll be within the relationship. That's why so many relationships start with enchantment and end in frustration. The projected image begins to crumble, and the other reveals themselves as different from what you idealized. In this sense, attraction isn't just an outward movement, it's an inward one. When you start wondering why certain people impact you so much, why specific traits enchant or disturb you, you begin to access a deeper territory of your own psyche. A territory that doesn't reveal itself easily but has always been there, waiting to be seen. Intense relationships aren't always about love. Often, they're about rediscovery, about mirrors, about forgotten aspects knocking at your door when someone awakens something hidden. How you handle this determines the kind of bond you build. If you remain unconscious, you get trapped in a cycle of idealizations and disappointments. But if you start recognizing what's being triggered in the relationship stops being an escape and becomes a path. Everyone has experienced some kind of repetition. You enter a new relationship thinking this time will be different, but over time, you realize the script is the same arguments, the same emptiness, the same pain in the end. The only thing that changes is the face. The story feels new, but the sensation is old. This doesn't happen by chance or bad luck. There's a reason for the repetition, and Jung was one of the few to look it straight in the eye. The shadow. The shadow is everything you don't accept in yourself. Traits that were repressed because, at some point in life, you learned they weren't welcome. It could be your anger, your sensitivity, your desire, your vulnerability. It could even be your strength, if it was judged as dangerous or inappropriate. Once repressed, it all goes into the unconscious, but it doesn't disappear. On the contrary, the more it's denied, the more active it becomes, And one of the most effective ways the shadow manifests is through relationships. That's why you're drawn to people who seem to have exactly what you don't or what you can't express. It's also why certain behaviors in others irritate you deeply, even if you don't know why. The shadow acts as a mirror. You see in the other what you hide in yourself, and because you don't recognize it as yours, you start believing the problem is always with them. This process is so subtle you don't notice it, but it shapes your emotional bonds. When you repress your own need for affection, you might be drawn to cold, uncaring people. When you reject your own aggression, you might end up in relationships with domineering partners. When you don't embrace your insecurity, you might constantly seek validation, erasing yourself to avoid being abandoned. And so, the cycle repeats. Not because you want it, but because your psyche is trying to show you something. It's trying to force you to look at what was left behind. Jung said that what you don't bring to consciousness returns as fate. Relationships are one of the most painful and most precise ways to see this. When the same dynamic keeps repeating, it's not bad luck. It's shadow. It's unconscious content begging for recognition. The repetition isn't punishment. It's an attempt at healing. Your psyche creates similar situations to give you a chance to respond differently. But as long as you remain unconscious, you'll keep reacting the same way. The trickiest part is that the shadow doesn't just show up in conflict. It also shapes your desires, what you seek in someone, what you idealize as the love of your life. Often, what you call overwhelming passion is really an intense projection of what you haven't yet recognized in yourself. That's why, when that projection fades, the relationship collapses. You weren't relating to the real person. You were relating to the image you created of them. Recognizing the shadow is one of the most important steps to breaking these patterns. It's not about blame, but about awareness, about understanding that relationships don't happen in a vacuum. They're shaped by your emotional history, your wounds, your repressions, and as long as those parts remain hidden, they'll keep choosing for you, even when you think you're in control. The shadow in love reveals itself in unchecked jealousy, fear of abandonment, emotional dependency, the tendency to repeat toxic relationships. But it also shows up in idealization, the need to save the other, the desire for total fusion. All of this has a common root, the unconscious attempt to rediscover in the other what you haven't integrated in yourself. When you start seeing these patterns clearly, something shifts. You stop entering relationships trying to complete yourself. You stop looking for someone to fill your emotional gaps. You begin taking responsibility for your own pain, for your own healing. And that's when relationships stop being repetitions and start becoming real encounters. Much of the suffering in relationships comes from the illusion that the other person is the problem, that they don't know how to love, that they shut down, that they don't care properly, don't respect, don't deliver. But in Carl Jung's perspective, this way of thinking reveals far more about the one perceiving than the one being perceived. Because in our closest bonds, the other is almost never just the other. They're a reflection. Jung said that what we don't recognize in ourselves, we project. We project our repressed desires, our insecurities, our need for control, our fragility, and the other, unknowingly, becomes the stage where these contents play out. That's why relationships reveal so much. They're living mirrors of what you haven't yet had the courage to face within yourself. When you get upset about someone's coldness, you might be confronting your own difficulty expressing emotion. When you accuse someone of being distant, you might be seeing a reflection of your own emotional avoidance. When you feel smothered by someone, it might be your fear of surrender that's being triggered. And when you constantly feel undervalued, you might be projecting your own self-devaluation onto them without realizing it. The way you interpret the other's actions is filtered through your emotional history, through how you learn to protect yourself, through the experiences that marked you and created patterns of perception. That's why what you feel isn't always what the other is doing. Sometimes, what you feel is an echo of something older, deeper, something reactivated in that relationship. This mechanism is so subtle you can spend years living the same conflict without realizing it's being created from the inside out. That, the person you're with, is only touching wounds that existed before they arrived. Wounds that belong to you but haven't been seen clearly. And that's where the transformative potential of relationships lies. When you stop reacting automatically and start asking, What does this say about me? You create space for awareness. You move out of the cycle of blame and into the process of self-discovery. You begin using the relationship not as confirmation of your wounds, but as a tool to understand them. This doesn't mean the other never messes up, or that everything is your responsibility, but it does mean there's an invisible field activated in every relationship, a field where the other becomes a symbol, where every gesture, every absence, every harsh word carries meaning beyond the present moment. The more you resist this, the more you hurt yourself, because you keep demanding from the other something that deep down is asking for recognition within you. Jung spoke of the importance of integrating unconscious contents so they'd stop ruling our lives. In this sense, relationships are the most effective teachers, because no one activates your shadow like the person you love. No one touches your fears as deeply as someone close. And that's exactly why love can hurt so much, because it forces you to see. And seeing often means descending into internal places you've denied for years. But that seeing also holds the key, because when you start recognizing what's yours, you stop demanding the other behave a certain way to make you feel okay. You take responsibility for what you feel, for what you interpret, for what you need to heal, and the bond becomes more honest, lighter, more human. The other stops being an enemy or a savior and becomes a mirror that doesn't just show beauty, it shows truth. It shows what you need to see. It shows what's still unconscious. And above all, it shows that loving isn't about merging, it's about seeing and having the courage to keep seeing, even when the reflection unsettles you. No love story begins the moment two people meet. It starts long before that, in the first years of life, in the simplest and quietest experiences that shaped what you feel, what you seek, what you fear. Jung understood this. He saw that what you lived through in childhood leaves such deep marks that they continue influencing, without you realizing it, the relationships you choose and how you behave within them. In childhood, you had no filters. You absorbed everything: gestures, silences, absences, rejections, looks. You learned through your body, through tone of voice, through responses or their absence. And there, without knowing it, you began forming emotional patterns that over time turned into silent beliefs. I need to be strong, to be loved. If I cry, they'll pull away. Staying quiet is safer. No one will stay forever. These words were never spoken, but they were lived, and they stuck. These beliefs don't fade. They become lenses, filters that distort how you see love. And unconsciously, you start seeking in relationships what confirms what you learned. If you learned you must please to avoid abandonment, you might become someone who erases themselves to keep the other close. If you learned you can't trust, you create distance even while craving closeness. If you learned love hurts, you feel uneasy when someone offers care. Childhood isn't just a phase of life, it's a foundation. And when that foundation is built on pain, abandonment, or emotional invalidation, it shapes your bonds with a force you don't see, but feel. You feel it especially when you fall in love, because loving stirs memories, reopens wounds, touches the oldest records, even if you're not aware of it. That's why you sometimes feel like a child in a relationship, needy, insecure, dependent, terrified of being left. Not because the other is doing something wrong, but because something old is being triggered, something frozen in time, something that now finds a voice in the present. Jung said the unconscious doesn't forget, it repeats. It creates experiences similar to the ones that hurt you, not to punish you, but to give you a new chance to respond differently. That's why you're drawn to people who, without you realizing it, remind you of key figures from childhood. Sometimes someone emotionally distant like your father, or someone demanding perfection like your mother. You don't seek this consciously, but your psyche does. It seeks because it wants to heal, because it wants to resolve what was left unfinished. As long as you don't look at this route, you stay trapped in repetition. You keep trying to fix the past through the present. You keep demanding from your current partner an answer that belongs to an old pain. And that's a burden no one can bear. Not you, not them. The only way to break this cycle is by bringing awareness to it, starting to realize that your current pain might not just be about this person, this relationship, this situation. It might be about something deeper, older, more foundational, something that needs to be felt, acknowledged, embraced, something that won't be resolved with a new relationship, but with a new way of looking at yourself. For Jung, mature love is only possible when we stop acting like children in relationships, when we stop expecting the other to give us what our parents didn't, when we stop demanding the present repair the past. It's not easy, but it's necessary, because only then can we love with maturity, without dependency, without idealization, without carrying the weight of our history on the shoulders of someone who just arrived. Often, you don't fall in love with the person. You fall in love with what they represent, with the image you've built of them, the qualities you've assigned, the fantasies you've created, and that image doesn't always match reality. Carl Jung described this phenomenon clearly. He called it projection, an unconscious process where you attribute your own contents, desires, traits, wounds, unrecognized qualities to the other. Without realizing it, you start seeing in them what's inside you but hasn't yet been integrated. Projection is powerful because it makes the bond feel magical. You feel like you've found someone unique, that this person completes you, understands you, transforms you. But what's really happening is that you're seeing a piece of yourself reflected there. The other becomes a living mirror, and that mirror, when you're still unaware of what you're projecting, feels like reality itself. This is one reason why intense relationships often end in frustration. As time passes, the person's reality starts to emerge, and that reality doesn't always align with the initial projection. The other begins to show limitations, contradictions, traits you didn't expect. What once felt like a deep connection starts to fray, not because the bond was fake, but because the projected illusion begins to crumble. This rupture is painful. It forces you to face that what you loved wasn't the other, but the image you created of them. And that image was often made up of repressed parts of yourself. The freedom you don't live, the sensitivity you don't allow yourself, the strength you've never dared to express. All of this gets projected onto the other with an intensity that feels like passion. But deep down, it's an attempt to reconnect with yourself. Jung said we project most intensely what we haven't yet recognized, and this includes both light and shadow. Sometimes you idealize someone, placing in them all the qualities you wish you had. Other times, you condemn and reject with aggression traits that are actually your own repressed ones. The hardest part is that this happens without you noticing, because projection, by definition, is unconscious. That's why the most important question in relationships isn't, who is this person, but what does this person awaken in me that's mine? When you start asking this, you break the cycle of idealization. You begin to see the other as they are, with their lights and shadows, without needing them to be a perfect mirror for your needs. At the same time, you start reclaiming the pieces of yourself you've been placing in them. This process isn't simple. Seeing the other as they are requires you to see yourself first, to recognize your denied desires, forgotten traits, unhealed wounds. That can be uncomfortable, but it's also liberating, because as long as you're in love with the projected image, you won't see the real person. You'll keep loving a reflection, expecting it to behave like your fantasy, and no relationship can sustain that for long. The turning point comes when you start distinguishing projection from presence, when you stop demanding the other fill you and start asking what you're trying to fill, when you realize that enchantment might be telling you more about your psyche than about them, and when you accept that what you're desperately seeking in the other might actually be a part of yourself you haven't yet dared to embrace. In Jung's theory, two fundamental concepts help explain why so many relationships seem to fail even when love exists: anima and animus. The anima represents the inner image of the feminine in a man's psyche. The animus, the inner image of the masculine in a woman's psyche. These archetypes aren't just about gender. They're internal energies, symbolic forces that live in every human being, regardless of sex. Jung realized that when these inner images aren't well integrated, they get projected onto others, especially those we love. When a man doesn't recognize his own sensitivity, intuition, or receptivity, aspects tied to his anima, he tends to project that energy onto women, not just any woman, but one who unconsciously embodies the inner image he's repressed. The same happens with a woman and her animus. When she doesn't integrate her strength, reason, or autonomy, she projects it onto a man. Without realizing it, the other becomes a carrier of something missing within us. This dynamic creates intense idealization. The loved one stops being just who they are and starts representing an unrecognized part of ourselves. Love then becomes a kind of reunion with what's been lost in our own soul. But since it's a projection, that reunion is never complete. Deep down, you're trying to access in someone else what you should be finding in yourself. That's where many relationships collapse. What was loved wasn't the other. It was the projected archetype, the image of the perfect mother, the protective father, the intuitive woman, the strong, secure man. But no one can sustain an image forever. When the other steps out of that role, when they start showing their human truth, frustration sets in, and with it, conflict. This is the incomplete love Jung warned about. Love that doesn't stem from real presence, but from symbolic lack. A love that seeks outside what should be cultivated within. As long as you don't integrate your anima or animus, you'll keep projecting. You'll keep seeking in the other what you haven't recognized in yourself. You'll keep falling for symbols, representations, fragments of your own psyche scattered in others. But integration isn't theoretical. It's a lived process, one that demands self-awareness, inner silence, and confrontation with your own imbalances. A man who fears his vulnerability must learn to access it without relying on a woman to embody it. A woman who fears her independence must learn to assert it without needing a man as her sole source of protection. Only then can you move from childish, needy, symbolic love to mature love. In mature love, the other isn't your complement, they're your companion. You no longer see them as the sole source of what you lack, but as someone walking beside you as you become whole. The relationship stops being a stage for projections and becomes a space for real encounters, where each takes responsibility for their own growth. Integrating the animus and anima is a crucial step in individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are. Until that happens, relationships will remain distorted mirrors, intense and confusing experiences where true love mixes with the unconscious attempt to rediscover yourself. Not everything you call a choice is truly conscious. You think you're deciding clearly, that you're seeking someone compatible, balanced, who treats you well. But then you find yourself entangled with someone who triggers your deepest insecurities, who touches your fears, who repeats old patterns, and you wonder, why does this keep happening? What's wrong with me? For Jung, the answer lies in the unconscious, and how it shapes your choices without you realizing it. The unconscious is more than a repository of forgotten memories. It's alive. It's active all the time. And often, it feels before you rationally understand. That knot in your stomach, the sense of familiarity with someone you just met, the feeling you've lived this before. These aren't coincidences. They're signs of something deeper, the activation of unconscious contents that recognize, in that encounter, something needing to be seen. That's why what you call attraction might actually be a call from your psyche. A call to look at old wounds, to integrate denied aspects, to face patterns that have been repeating for years. As long as you don't understand this, you'll keep thinking it's love guiding you. But in reality, it's the unconscious, and it always guides you toward what needs healing. This is why you sometimes feel an intense connection with someone who doesn't align with your conscious values, who doesn't fit your plans or your life stage, yet something in you clings, grasps, deludes itself, because the unconscious recognized a mirror there, a trigger, a piece of the emotional puzzle that hasn't yet been placed. These unconscious choices aren't random, they're pedagogical. Your psyche is constantly trying to bring to light what's been repressed, and relationships are one of the most effective ways to do that. In intimate bonds, masks fall, hidden traits emerge. The body reacts before the mind justifies. That's why love can feel so confusing. It doesn't come just from reason. It comes from trauma, absence, unnamed desire. Jung said that what isn't integrated returns as fate. That's exactly what happens when you keep falling for the same people, repeating the same cycles, attracting the same conflicts. It's not the universe against you. It's not bad luck. It's an unconscious pattern trying to manifest, trying to be seen, trying to be transformed. But for that to happen, you need to move beyond shallow, rational explanations. Stop trying to explain everything with logic. Start listening to your body, the visceral reactions, the disproportionate emotions. That's where the unconscious lives. That's where choices are made, even when you think you're in control. When you start noticing these signs, something shifts. You stop blaming yourself, stop blaming the other, stop looking for culprits, and you start investigating. What's this situation trying to show me? Why do I feel this way with this person? What's familiar about this pain? These questions don't bring immediate answers, but they create space for awareness. And once awareness enters, the pattern loses its grip. That's what separates an unconscious relationship from a conscious bond. In the first, you react. In the second, you observe. And observing is the first step to transformation, because you can only change what you recognize. For Jung, love is precisely this place of revelation, where everything hidden comes to light, not to destroy you, but to show you who you haven't yet dared to be. You say you want something new, a healthy, light, true love. But when you look back, you see your relationships follow the same script, with slight variations in the cast. Different people, similar stories, the same sense of abandonment, the same lack of reciprocity, the same exhausting effort to be seen, understood, or loved. And then the question arises, almost like a constant whisper, why do I always end up in the same place? Carl Jung answered this with a phrase that seems simple, but carries deep weight. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. What he's saying is that no matter how much you want something different, your desire isn't in charge, it's your wounded psyche. It's the set of emotional patterns you formed in childhood, which became part of your inner structure and keep seeking resolution through relationships. This cycle of repetition isn't conscious. No one chooses to get hurt again, but the unconscious chooses for you when something remains unresolved. It seeks out situations like the old ones because, symbolically, it believes that's where it can heal what was left open. That's why you're drawn to the same dynamics, even when you rationally know they're not good for you. If you learned in childhood that love comes with effort, you'll seek relationships where you have to prove yourself constantly. If you learned affection is scarce, you'll tolerate crumbs of care. If you learned being yourself wasn't enough to be loved, you'll become someone who pleases, hides emotions, pretends to be fine. You don't realize you're repeating, because this movement happens below awareness, but the result is always there, the feeling you're reliving something familiar even when it all seems new. Jung saw relationships as mirrors of the psyche. He said emotional life repeats until the soul learns what it needs to. This means the cycle isn't punishment, it's an invitation. An invitation to stop running from your own story, your own wounds, your own patterns, because only when you face them honestly can you interrupt the flow of repetition. Repetition happens because something inside you is waiting to be recognized, a part of you that wasn't embraced, that was rejected, neglected, ignored. And now, in relationships, it tries to show up again, disguised as neediness, jealousy, insecurity, or a need for control. These feelings aren't the problem. They're the symptom. The problem is what's behind them, the wounded child trying to speak. When you don't acknowledge this, you go on autopilot. You react the same way every time, attract the same kinds of bonds, and deep down, you repeat the same moves hoping for a different outcome. But there's no real change without awareness, and no awareness without confrontation. Confrontation with your own pain, with your own role in the choices that hurt, with the emotional patterns that, painful as they are, still offer a familiar kind of safety, because at its core, the familiar comforts, even if it's toxic, even if it hurts, even if it destroys. The unconscious doesn't seek what's best for you, it seeks what's known. That's why so many people stay in cycles of suffering. Known pain feels safer than unknown love. Breaking this cycle takes courage. Courage to look within, to explore the roots, to let go of blame and take responsibility, not as self-criticism but as liberation. Because as long as you believe things are just like this, nothing will change. But when you realize the pattern is in you, not the other, you step into the place of transformation. Repetition isn't the end, it's the beginning. The the start of a journey toward inner truth, a journey where love stops being a realm of unconscious repetition and becomes a conscious experience of growth, where you no longer seek what you lack, but draw closer to what makes you whole. And from there, everything changes, because you stop repeating and start choosing. You believe you chose that person. You believe it was your decision based on what you felt, what you saw, what you hoped to experience. But as the relationship unfolds, as patterns emerge, as wounds resurface, something inside you realizes that choice wasn't as free as you thought. In fact, it was your past choosing for you. That intense connection might just be another repetition of what you've already lived through and haven't healed. Jung spoke of this with clarity. Trauma doesn't vanish with time. It hides, transforms, disguises itself in attitudes, thoughts, desires, and above all, it seeps into emotional relationships. Trauma creates a silent emotional programming. It shapes what you expect from others. It defines what you consider love. It determines how you react to affection, rejection, absence, abandonment. That's why so many people feel trapped in relationships that hurt them, because trauma distorts the perception of love. It makes you confuse intensity with care, control with protection, absence with freedom, pain with passion. And so you gravitate toward people who, subtly or overtly, reproduce the dynamics that wounded you in the past, not because you want to suffer, but because your unconscious believes that by reliving that pain, it can finally overcome it, except that almost never happens, because most of the time, you're not aware you're reliving. You think you're starting something new when in reality, you're continuing something old, something that began in childhood, something with the faces of other people but the same emotional script. Emotional trauma is circular. It leads you to seek the same kind of relationship, to behave the same way, to fall into the same traps, all without noticing. This is the great illusion of choice. The illusion that you're in control when in truth you're being guided by wounds that haven't yet healed. And the worst part is that this process is reinforced by society, by the stories you consume, by narratives that romanticize suffering in the name of love. You hear that love hurts, that relationships are hard, that no one's perfect, and you end up normalizing what should be unacceptable, justifying destructive behaviors, enduring the unendurable. But there's a difference between enduring and choosing consciously. True choice only happens when you understand where you're coming from, when you recognize the impulses driving you, when you identify that overwhelming attraction might not be love, it might just be an unconscious attempt to fix what you experienced with your father, your mother, that childhood void no one saw. This is a central point in Jung's view. As long as the unconscious is in charge, you're bound to the past. But when you start illuminating those hidden parts, you gain freedom, not an illusory freedom, but real emotional freedom. The freedom to not repeat, to not cling, to not confuse pain with connection, to not surrender to relationships that merely replay trauma in a different guise. This doesn't mean becoming cold, closed off, or mistrustful. It means becoming lucid, able to distinguish between what's love and what's repetition, between what's surrender and what's dependency, between what's connection and what's neediness. And that lucidity only comes when you're brave enough to confront your trauma, not as a victim, but as someone choosing to heal. When you allow yourself this lucidity, something shifts. The intensity of destructive connections fades. Peace starts to feel more appealing than chaos. Care becomes more desirable than emotional pursuit. And little by little, you realize that true love isn't about filling wounds. It's about not needing someone bleeding beside you to validate the pain you've already learned to tend to alone. At first glance, it seems the problem lies with the other, in the actions that hurt, the words that wound, the lack of care, the emotional instability. But if you look deeper, you'll notice something uncomfortable. The other is only revealing something already inside you. It's not about blame, but about reflection, about the mirror that relationships represent. And this is where Jung's psychology becomes a key to understanding the hidden side of emotional connections. Jung said relationships reveal our shadow, that part of the psyche you've spent your life trying to hide, control, or deny, the insecure, needy, reactive part, the part you conceal from others, and even from yourself. But when you enter a relationship, that part starts to show. Because intimate bonds have this power. They activate what's unconscious, bring to light what's hidden, expose what you didn't know still hurt. The other becomes a mirror that doesn't just show what you like, but one that reflects, with precision, what you don't want to see. Your tendency to erase yourself, your fear of rejection, your struggle to set boundaries, your constant need for approval, your impulse to control, your repressed anger, the neediness you mask with kindness, every conflict, every discomfort, every feeling of powerlessness in the relationship has something to say about you. This is one of the greatest challenges of the emotional journey, to stop pointing at the mirror and start looking at what it reflects. It's not about excusing the other or accepting abuse or toxic behavior. It's about understanding what's being triggered inside you, because as long as you keep running from the reflected image, you'll keep falling into the same patterns. You'll keep expecting the other to change, to be more this or less that, without realizing the real movement begins with you. This reflection is profound because it demands emotional responsibility. And responsibility, contrary to what many think, isn't about blaming yourself. It's about recognizing yourself, seeing how you contribute to the dynamic, how your history influences your tolerance for disrespect, how your fears shape your choices, how your inner absences make you accept less than you deserve. Often you get involved with emotionally unavailable people because, deep down, you're not emotionally available to yourself. You seek someone to nurture you, but you haven't learned to nurture yourself. You expect the other to recognize you, but you don't recognize yourself. You demand presence, but you don't know how to be present with your own pain. And that's how repetition takes hold. The other merely activates what's already in you. Jung said the other is often the one carrying the content you've repressed. That's why the most intense relationships are also the most challenging, because they stir everything up. They touch your wounds. They reveal the child in you still waiting to be chosen. They show how tied you still are to old patterns of validation. And that's not a bad thing. It's just a sign the mirror is working, that you're getting a chance to see. Seeing hurts, because it requires confronting parts of yourself you'd rather keep buried. But it also liberates, because you can only transform what you see. You can only heal what you acknowledge. And that's how a relationship stops being a prison and becomes an opportunity to grow, to mature, to become whole. When you start seeing the other as a mirror, everything changes. Fights stop being just fights. They become revelations. Pain gains context, reactions make sense, and you realize you're constantly looking at yourself through the other. Some people will show your strength, others your fragility. Some will affirm your light. Others will expose your shadow. All of them, without exception, have something to say about you. And listening to that is the first step to transformation. Behind many of your behaviors in a relationship, there's a voice that isn't adult, a voice that can't rationalize, that doesn't understand the other's limits, that doesn't accept the timing of things, a voice that wants to be seen all the time, that panics in the face of absence, that withdraws at criticism, that cries out for affection when it feels it's losing. This is the voice of your inner child, not the joyful, spontaneous one, but the one that grew up with emotional gaps that were never filled. And it's often this child who takes the driver's seat in your emotional life. You might be 30, 40, 50 years old. You might have lived many experiences, might even seem mature in many areas. But if your inner child is wounded, it will show up. It'll appear when you feel ignored, when your partner doesn't respond, and something inside you collapses. When someone doesn't return your affection and you take it as personal rejection. When you erase yourself, adapt, stay silent, all to avoid being left. These movements aren't new. They come from far back, from a childhood where you might not have felt important, or felt you had to do a lot to get a little. Maybe you had to grow up too fast. Maybe you got used to living with absent parents, emotionally immature ones, or ones who projected their own pain onto you, and without realizing it, you formed an unconscious association. Love is suffering. Love is chasing. Love is shrinking to be accepted. Carl Jung understood this deeply. For him, the inner child doesn't disappear. It transforms into part of the adult psyche. If nurtured, it becomes strength, authenticity, vitality. But if ignored, it turns into neediness, fear, and an endless quest for approval. This child doesn't want a relationship. It wants a lap to sit on. It wants unconditional acceptance. It wants to hear what it never heard, and so it clings to bonds that seem romantic on the surface, but in practice are attempts to relive a love that was never experienced. That's how neediness shows up. You don't want the other. You want the affection you never had. You don't love that person. You love the idea that finally you'll be cared for, that this time someone will stay. And when they don't, the pain isn't just from now. It's the pain of a child who waited and wasn't met, who cried and wasn't heard, who asked and had to stay quiet. This need for validation comes from there too. It's not enough to be in a relationship. You need constant reminders that you're loved, wanted, important. You need gestures, words, endless proof. And when they don't come, your inner child sounds the alarm. They're abandoning me. Again, anxiety rises, jealousy emerges, fear explodes. And once again, love becomes a survival game, not a connection. The key to changing this isn't demanding more from the other. It's tending to the child you carry, recognizing its pain, without dramatizing it, embracing its fears without becoming their hostage, because as long as it's unheard, it'll scream, and every scream will sabotage your relationships, adding weight where there should be lightness, turning presence into obligation, love into dependency. Healing doesn't happen from the outside in. The other's presence might ease things, but it can't replace your own care. No relationship will give you what you haven't given yourself. No person will fill the hole left from childhood. The most the other can do is walk beside you as you tend to yourself, as you learn to say to that child, I'm here now. This inner shift changes everything, because when the child is nurtured, the adult can love, can choose with clarity, can let go of what doesn't serve, can receive without begging, can surrender without losing themselves, because they're no longer seeking a parent or a savior in the other. They're just sharing who they are, without the burden of needing to be saved. And it's in that place that love truly becomes possible. After so many attempts, so much pain, so many repetitions, there comes a moment when something in you shifts, not because life got easier, not because you found the right person, but because you started seeing yourself, realizing that the relationships you've lived were, in fact, reflections of what wasn't yet integrated within you. Jung said, love reveals that every human encounter is a chance, sometimes painful, sometimes transformative, to see what you've hidden from yourself your whole life. Love then stops being just an intense emotion, stops being a place to seek wholeness, and becomes a definitive mirror. A mirror that doesn't just show your neediness, but also your strength, that doesn't reflect only your shadows, but also your light. A mirror that makes it clear everything you've lived until now wasn't by chance. It was parts of your soul trying to find themselves. At this point, you stop blaming, stop trying to figure out why the other didn't stay, why they didn't choose you, why it was so hard. Because you understand the other didn't come to complete you, they came to show you the parts of yourself still fragmented, to show you the patterns that needed breaking, to show you how far you were from yourself. When you integrate all this, something new emerges, discernment. You no longer cling to those who trigger your wounds. You don't persist in bonds that push you away from who you are. You stop entering relationships trying to prove your worth, fix the other, or receive the love you never got in childhood. You start moving from a different place, a calmer, truer, more whole place, and curiously, that's when love starts to happen for real. When you stop seeking it as an escape, when you no longer need it to exist, when you don't enter a relationship with emptiness in your hands, when you stop projecting onto the other the responsibility for your happiness. Jung called this individuation, the process by which you stop being just a reflection of what you've lived and become who you truly are. In this state, love isn't urgency, it's presence. It's not neediness, it's exchange. It's not necessity, it's freedom. Because you've learned to be with yourself, learned to listen to yourself, to tend to what hurts, to respect your own timing, and above all, learned that life isn't punishing you when someone leaves, it's teaching you to choose yourself. When you choose yourself, the mirror changes. You start attracting more conscious relationships, bonds that don't reinforce wounds, but help heal them. People who don't come to fill a void, but to walk with you. And even if those people don't stay forever, what remains is clarity. The clarity that love is, above all, a process of integration. Because loving isn't losing yourself in someone, it's finding in the other a reflection of your own wholeness, and letting that reflection take you deeper, not away from yourself, but within, where everything begins, where everything heals, where at last love can be real.